I was on a routine patrol near North Platte, driving the stretch of highway that cuts through the open fields west of the Platte River. It was late afternoon, the sky a dull gray, the kind that makes the horizon blend into the ground. I had been patrolling for hours, mostly quiet, occasional trucks and cars rolling by. I'd passed a few small farmhouses, nothing unusual. The air had a slight chill, hinting at winter, and I kept the heater on low to ward off the cold creeping through the car vents. I spotted a pickup truck about a half-mile ahead, drifting slightly between lanes. At first, I thought the driver might just be tired, maybe a long haul from the city. But the swaying became more noticeable. The truck wasn't accelerating or braking erratically, just floating across the white line every few seconds. I flipped on my lights and started closing the distance, expecting the driver to slow down or pull over. When I got alongside the truck, I slowed and moved in behind it. That's when it hit me. It was almost eerily quiet, except for the hum of the engine. I noticed that the truck had no tailgate hitch lights flashing, nothing out of the ordinary, except the slight swaying. I signaled the driver to pull over, lights on, and watched as the truck eased onto the shoulder. I stepped out of my cruiser, the cold immediately biting through my uniform. The road was empty, surrounded by miles of open fields and a few distant farm silos. There was a faint smell of exhaust mixed with wet dirt and decaying leaves. I walked cautiously toward the driver's side, hand resting on my holster, eyes scanning. When I reached the window and leaned slightly to look inside, I froze. The driver's seat was empty. No one. The engine was running, the lights were on, and a half-eaten sandwich sat on the center console. My eyes instinctively went to the steering wheel. There, smeared across the leather, was a handprint, dark red, sticky, unmistakably blood. I stepped back slowly, my mind racing. The truck was completely still now, except for the gentle vibration from the running engine. I called it in, giving my location, a description of the truck, and what I had found. The dispatcher's voice sounded normal over the radio comm, but I could feel my own pulse quickening. I moved around the truck, checking the immediate surroundings. There was nothing unusual. No footprints in the gravel leading away, no signs of a struggle near the shoulder. I checked the passenger side carefully, looking for anyone hiding or injured, but it was empty. The blooded handprint on the wheel stayed with me, a stark contrast against the tan leather interior. I noticed the sandwich again, the wrapper crumpled, a bite missing. Whoever had been here had just stopped, or maybe hadn't even planned to leave. Dispatch managed to trace the plates, and the information sent a shiver down my spine. The truck belonged to a man who had been reported missing 3 days prior. His family had called in after he failed to return home from a short trip. He was known to take day drives around the countryside, sometimes staying out later than expected, but 3 days was abnormal. I called for backup. I didn't want to touch anything inside the truck until investigators arrived, but I couldn't just leave it running on the shoulder either. I set the parking brake, turned off the engine carefully, and stepped back, keeping a hand near my flashlight. I walked the perimeter again, checking for any sign of disturbance, anything out of place. The road stretched empty in both directions, wind starting to stir, rattling the tall grasses beside the highway. While waiting, I noticed small details that didn't register at first. The windshield had tiny smudges, as if someone had tried to wipe something away. The floor mats were muddy, and the driver's side door handle had fingerprints on it, not all matching the owner's. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but it made me uneasy. When the backup arrived, they took over traffic control, letting me focus on securing the scene. Crime scene investigators arrived shortly after, walking around with cameras, measuring tapes, and evidence bags. They took careful photos of the handprint, the sandwich, and the interior of the truck. The truck was eventually towed to the station for processing. I stayed on the highway for the next few hours, keeping an eye out for any sign of the missing man. The sun was setting now, a pale orange light fading behind the horizon. The empty fields took on long shadows, and the chill in the air deepened. I drove slowly, scanning ditches, farm roads, and gravel pullouts, but there was no trace. Later that evening, after reports were filed and the scene was secured, I returned to the station. The dispatcher handed me a sheet with the missing man's details. He was in his mid-40s, lived alone, no history of mental illness, and a quiet life. Nothing in his records indicated that he would leave without a word. The thought gnawed at me. 3 days was too long for someone to just vanish, and the state of the truck suggested he had not left willingly. Over the next few days, the investigation unfolded. Forensic teams processed the truck thoroughly, checking fingerprints, blood samples, and fibers. The blood on the steering wheel matched the missing man, confirming that he had been injured inside the vehicle. Investigators traced the route he had been on with GPS data and cell phone pings, reconstructing his movements. The search parties combed the nearby fields, abandoned barns, and wooded areas. They brought in cadaver dogs and aerial surveillance. I went along on several of the searches, trudging through thick mud, frost-covered grass, and shallow creeks, scanning for any sign. Days passed with nothing. No body, no personal items, no indication of where he could have gone. Then, on the fourth day, a hiker reported something unusual near a seldom-used service road about 6 miles from where the truck was found. Investigators went to the location and discovered an old drainage canal partially hidden by tall reeds and weeds. Inside, they found a makeshift campsite. It was small and hastily constructed, as if someone had tried to hide there. There was evidence of a struggle, broken branches, bloodstains on rocks and soil, and a few personal items belonging to the missing man: a wallet, a hat, and a pair of work gloves. The site gave investigators a better idea of what had happened. The man had likely been injured, possibly in an accident or assaulted, then tried to get away from the truck and find a place to shelter. He had attempted to survive on his own, leaving traces of his presence in the nearby fields. It became clear he had suffered greatly over those days. A week later, a search team finally located him in a shallow creek bed, a few hundred yards from the makeshift campsite. He had succumbed to exposure and injuries sustained earlier, likely from falling while trying to navigate the rough terrain. The body was in a remote area, difficult to see from the road, which explained why no one had found him immediately. The case closed with a quiet sense of relief mixed with sadness. The bloodied truck, the empty driver's seat, and the handprint on the wheel had all been a harrowing puzzle that ultimately led to understanding what had happened. It was a tragic end to an ordinary day gone wrong, but it was also a reminder of how fragile life could be, especially when accidents or injuries happen far from help. Months later, whenever I drove past that stretch of highway, I couldn't help but glance at the shoulder, half expecting to see an abandoned vehicle, half hoping not to. The details of that day stayed with me: the engine running, the half-eaten sandwich, the handprint, and the knowledge that sometimes, even in the middle of a quiet highway in Nebraska, life could change in an instant, leaving only the smallest clues behind. The missing man's family eventually received closure, and the truck was returned after processing, a somber relic of what had occurred. It wasn't a dramatic scene with loud chaos or sudden terror. It was quiet, ordinary, and yet, it left a mark on anyone who saw it. Life can end silently, in plain sight, and it's the ordinary details, the little things, that sometimes tell the story best. It was one of those nights where the cold feels like it seeps straight into your bones. The kind of snowstorm that makes visibility almost nil, and even the brightest streetlights blur under the heavy flurries. I was driving my cruiser on the back roads outside town, the tires crunching against the packed snow, when a call came through the radio about a speeding sedan. A local resident had reported it weaving through the lanes dangerously fast, lights flashing on and off, disappearing and reappearing as if the driver had no regard for anything but the road. I noted the description: a dark blue sedan, older model, nothing flashy, and started scanning the roadway as I pushed my car a little faster. The snow made the pursuit tricky. The roads were slick, and each turn required slow, careful maneuvering to avoid losing control. I finally spotted the headlights in the distance, just ahead of a rise. The car was moving fast, skidding slightly on the turns, but nothing too extreme. I turned on my lights and sirens, giving chase, and it became obvious the driver saw me. For a moment, I thought he might try to run. But then, without warning, he took the next exit and disappeared behind a line of trees. I followed carefully, my tires crunching over the icy patches, feeling the sting of cold air biting through my jacket. I caught up a few minutes later on a stretch where the road straightened out. The car wasn't moving anymore. It was parked sideways on the shoulder, engine off, lights dim. The tires had made shallow tracks in the snow, pointing slightly toward the treeline, but the car itself was angled like someone had just slid it to the side and stepped out. I slowed, bringing my cruiser to a stop a few feet away, heart beginning to beat faster than normal. Something felt off immediately. The driver's seat was empty. I leaned forward, squinting through the snow-dusted windows, but the cabin was completely bare. My eyes then caught the rearview mirror. A small, handwritten note had been slipped under it, taped or tucked in. I wasn't sure. It read simply, "I see you." The words were clear, crisp against the small square of paper, and in that moment the hairs on my neck stood up. The snow around the car was fresh and undisturbed except for a set of footprints leading straight into the woods beside the shoulder. They were single, deep impressions, boots heavy in the snow, following a path that disappeared quickly into the darkness of the tree line. I got out of my car, my boots crunching in the snow, and approached the sedan cautiously. Every instinct in me screamed to be careful. The wind was cutting through my jacket, but it was nothing compared to the chill crawling up my spine. I moved slowly, circling the car, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the treeline, scanning for any movement. The branches groaned under the weight of the snow, cracking and snapping in the distance. I froze, listening. It sounded like something, or someone was moving through the trees, keeping pace with me. Branches snapping rhythmically, faint and deliberate, but just enough to make me tense. I checked the ground again. The snow around the sedan was smooth, untouched, except for the footprints leading into the woods. The set of prints near the treeline looked fresh, and they weren't fading. I followed them with my eyes, trying to tell if they went deeper into the forest or if someone had doubled back. The darkness made it impossible to see far, the only light coming from my flashlight and the dim glow of the street behind me. Every step I took crunching in the snow seemed to make the snapping in the woods react. It was like someone was mimicking me, or waiting for me to make a move. I stepped back toward my cruiser, deciding to wait for my partner to arrive. The thought of being alone in the woods in the middle of a snowstorm with someone following me was unsettling. My hand gripped the flashlight tightly, and my eyes kept darting to the trees, catching every shadow, every movement. The note in the rearview mirror repeated in my mind over and over. "I see you." It was simple, but the implication was terrifying. Whoever had left it, or whoever was out there, knew I was coming, and maybe even knew exactly where I was. Minutes felt like hours. The wind picked up, blowing the snow in sideways gusts, and the sound of snapping branches in the woods persisted. It was distant, but constant enough to make me flinch with every sound. I tried calling it in over the radio, keeping my voice steady, but the static made it difficult. Every time I glanced at the car, my mind flashed images of someone stepping out from the trees, just for a second, long enough for me to notice. My pulse raced, and I kept scanning, flashlight swinging slowly from left to right. Finally, I saw the headlights of my partner's cruiser cutting through the snow in the distance. Relief hit me immediately, but I didn't let my guard down. I waved him over, motioning to the car on the shoulder. As he pulled up and killed the engine, I explained quickly, pointing toward the footprints in the snow. We both stepped out cautiously, boots crunching as we examined the ground. The tracks into the woods were gone. Completely gone. No trace of anything moving through the snow. No prints, no broken branches, nothing. The snow had not fallen enough to cover them entirely. I could see that from the surrounding untouched ground. Yet the path that had led into the trees moments ago was simply gone. We looked around, scanning the area with our flashlights, but there was nothing. The note was still in the rearview mirror, taped securely, but there was no sign of anyone around. My partner radioed in to have another unit check the surrounding woods, but the snowstorm and darkness made it nearly impossible to track anyone. The silence felt thick, heavy, and the air itself seemed colder than before. After a careful search, we decided to tow the vehicle back to the station. We put it on the flatbed, making sure the note stayed intact, and climbed back into our cruisers. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as we drove slowly back toward town. Every shadow in the treeline seemed alive. Every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made me tense. By the time we reached the station, the snow had intensified, blanketing the roads in a quiet that was almost oppressive. Once inside, we documented everything. The vehicle was registered, but the owner had no record of being in the area, no calls to explain the erratic driving, and no one knew where he or she had gone. The note, the empty driver's seat, the footprints, and the sounds in the woods remained a mystery. For the rest of my shift, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling that same uneasy sense that someone had been watching me, just beyond the treeline. In the days that followed, reports came in from nearby areas about a dark blue sedan seen speeding in snowstorms, but always vanishing before anyone could approach it. We never found the driver, never discovered where the footprints led, and no one could explain how tracks that were once there could vanish entirely. The memory of that night stayed with me, the cold, the snow, the note, and the feeling that someone was always watching. I never stopped patrolling those back roads, but I always made sure to keep my partner close, flashlight ready, and eyes on every shadow in the trees. Even now, years later, when the snow falls heavy and the roads are empty, I remember that night, and I can't help but glance toward the treeline, half expecting to see a figure standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. It was a cold December evening, the kind where the air feels sharper than it should, cutting through the thin layer of uniform I had on. I was wrapping up my last few checks on my patrol route, tired from a long day of calls, when the dispatcher came through with a tip from a neighbor. The voice on the radio was calm, but had that underlying tension I'd come to recognize as serious. A resident on Maple Street reported unusual lights coming from the house at the end of the block. They said it looked like someone was having a party in the middle of the night, strange for a house that had been empty most of the year. I didn't think much of it at first. People sometimes forget to turn off Christmas decorations, and the house had a few older owners in the past. But something in the tone of the call stuck with me, that mix of unease and urgency. I decided to check it out myself. Pulling up in my cruiser, I parked across the street, keeping the engine running and my lights off. The house was small but neat, a two-story with siding that had seen better days. A single wreath hung on the front door, dusted with frost. The windows were all dark except one on the first floor that glowed with an amber light. I could see through the slightly frosted glass that the living room was bathed in warm light, and faintly, I could hear music. It wasn't anything modern, just a slow instrumental tune, like something you might hear on an old phonograph. The sound made the street feel unreal, like the house was a scene out of some old holiday film. I stepped out of my car, the snow crunching under my boots. The air was bitter and smelled faintly of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I approached the house cautiously, hand resting on the grip of my flashlight. I moved slowly along the walkway, my boots sinking slightly into the thin snow. As I neared the front window, I crouched slightly and peered in. The sight made me freeze in place. The living room was immaculate, almost unnervingly so. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, tall and perfectly decorated, with lights that blinked in a slow rhythm. A table sat in the center of the room, set for a large family. There were plates, silverware, crystal glasses, and a golden roasted turkey in the middle. Napkins were folded in precise triangles. What really caught my eye were the people. There were at least 5 of them, adults and children, all dressed in clothing that looked like it had come from the 1940s. The women wore long skirts, the men had vests and ties, the children wore tiny button-up outfits that were so precise and clean it felt staged. They were moving around the table, laughing silently, arranging food, placing candles in candle holders. Everything seemed perfectly normal, but at the same time completely impossible. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably an elaborate Christmas decoration, maybe mannequins or something. But as I watched, one of the figures looked directly toward me, or at least seemed to. My heart started to beat faster. I tapped on the glass lightly with my flashlight, trying to get a better look. Nothing changed, but I could swear the shadows around them shifted, like they were aware of me. I leaned back, trying to make sense of it, when I heard the door handle rattling behind me. I turned quickly, and the front door was swinging open on its own. A gust of cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of old wood and dust. I stepped inside immediately, flashlight sweeping the room. The house was empty. Every single figure I had seen through the window was gone. The table was still set perfectly, the turkey still gleaming under the light, but no one was there. No sound of footsteps, no creaking of floorboards, nothing. I moved cautiously into the living room, scanning every corner. The furniture was all in place, old but clean, not a trace of anyone having been here recently. The music still played faintly, but now I noticed that it wasn't coming from anywhere I could see. No speakers, no radio, nothing. Just the soft, mechanical ticking of the track moving along, like it had been recorded decades ago. My pulse was picking up, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to stay rational. I checked the windows. All of them were locked. The front door had a simple lock, but it had been swinging open, not unlocked from the inside. I walked around the living room again, running my hand along the edges of the table. The plates were cold. The turkey had no heat. It had been sitting there for hours, maybe longer. Nothing was warm. I walked into the kitchen, flashlight in hand. Everything was pristine, counters wiped clean, utensils in the drawers, pots and pans stacked neatly. It looked like someone had cleaned every inch of this place the night before. I started moving through the rest of the house. The bedrooms were empty, the beds made, nothing unusual. The bathrooms were spotless, and I found a note on the dresser in the master bedroom. It was a simple sheet of lined paper, handwritten in what looked like careful cursive. "Do not disturb." That was it. Nothing else. I held the paper carefully, trying to read any hidden message. There was none. I returned to the living room. The table, the lights, the music, everything was exactly as I had seen from the window. My hands were shaking slightly as I set down my flashlight and ran a hand through my hair. I couldn't explain what I had seen. There was no one there. No mannequins, no decorations that could mimic movement like that. No television, no screens, nothing to project the images. Yet I had seen them. My mind kept returning to the moment one of the children, or what I thought was a child, looked at me. It had felt intentional, like a glance that recognized I was there, a fleeting moment of awareness. I decided to call it in. I stepped back outside, the snow crunching under my boots again, and keyed the radio. "Unit 12, I need an additional unit at 246 Maple Street. Suspicious activity, possible trespass, but the residence appears empty at this time. Requesting a check." The dispatcher acknowledged and said backup was on the way. I waited in the car, eyes on the house, flashlight ready. The lights flickered again, and I could see movement in the corner of the living room from across the street. Shadows shifted as though someone, or something, was pacing behind the tree and the table. My stomach tightened. When the other unit arrived, we entered the house together. Every inch of it was checked methodically. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No fingerprints other than my own and the original owners from years ago. No recent footprints in the snow behind the house. No disturbance in the dust on the floor. The lights and the music, however, continued. I couldn't explain that. The officers shared skeptical looks, but we all agreed it was something that warranted documentation. Photos were taken, notes made, and a call to the owner's listed contact number was attempted. The line was disconnected. The house had been empty for months, or at least, no one had lived there according to utility records. I spent the next few hours patrolling the block, returning periodically to the house. Each time, the lights would come on at the same hour, the music would play faintly, and the table would remain set. But no one ever appeared again. No figures, no shadows moving. Only that single night had shown the living room as alive, the family as present. In the following days, I dug into historical records. The house had been owned by a family in the 1940s. There were old photographs of Christmas dinners, parties, children laughing, all dressed in the exact style I had seen. The owners had moved away decades ago. No one had lived there since. Even the furniture, the tableware, the turkey. I found references to items matching the ones I had seen in antique sales and estate auctions from that time. Everything lined up, and yet the experience was undeniable. I had seen the family, the movements, the laughter. Eventually, I closed the case, writing it off in my report as a transient projection, a trick of light, a combination of fatigue and imagination. But I never forgot the feeling of being watched, the sense that someone, or something, had noticed me. Driving past that house now, years later, I still notice the faint amber glow in the window, the slow flicker of lights at night, and the soft music that seems to drift out across the empty street. I've checked the house many times since, alone and with colleagues. Nothing ever happens again. The house is quiet, empty still. But I will always remember that night, and I will always remember that the table was set, the family was there, and the air felt alive in a way that no empty house ever should. Even after everything, I can't fully explain it, and I have learned to trust my instincts. Some things, no matter how real they seem, simply cannot be explained. All I know for sure is that I saw what I saw, and no one else ever will. I was on patrol that night, the fog rolling in thick from the coast, the 101 barely visible through the low-hanging mist. The radio crackled softly with the usual background chatter, nothing out of the ordinary, just calls for traffic stops, a few noise complaints, and a couple of stranded motorists. It was the kind of night where everything felt muted, as if the fog wasn't just outside but pressing into your chest, making it heavier to breathe. Then the call came in, a 911 hang-up at an abandoned motel off the highway. No voice, no one on the line, just the faint sound of static and a click. Nothing else. The dispatcher repeated the location, an old, shuttered motel I'd passed a few times on night patrol, but never had reason to investigate. The neon sign was half broken, vacancy flashing erratically in red and blue. It had been out of operation for years, and from the outside, it looked like a shell, a hollowed-out carcass of a place that once might have been busy. I drove in slowly, lights cutting through the fog, and parked at the edge of the cracked asphalt parking lot. The silence was heavy, thick, the kind of quiet where your own movements sound louder than they should. The wind tugged at the edges of the broken awning, making it sway and creak. I stepped out of the cruiser, boots crunching against gravel and broken glass. My flashlight cut through the fog, illuminating a few scattered remnants of the motel's past: rusted chairs, a stroller lying on its side, and shattered glass reflecting the light in tiny shards. The air smelled damp, musty, and vaguely of mold, the way abandoned buildings do when they've been left to rot. I moved toward the office first. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. I pushed it open carefully, hand hovering near my holster, expecting maybe a homeless person or someone squatting. Inside, it was dark and cold, the air stagnant. Dust hung in the beams of my flashlight. The desk was overturned, papers scattered, old brochures and motel key cards brittle and yellowed. Nothing was alive, nothing moved. I checked the phone lines, nothing, dead, all unplugged. The hang-up call had come from here, maybe, but with nothing connected, it was impossible. I decided to check the rooms, starting from the closest one. The hallways were narrow, walls painted with peeling pastel colors that had long since faded. The carpet was worn through, blackened in some areas, damp from whatever had seeped in from outside. The air was heavier here, almost suffocating. I opened room 12 carefully, the hinges whining. Inside, the room was dark except for the beam from my flashlight. A mattress lay on the floor, stained, torn, mold creeping along its edges. Broken furniture was stacked haphazardly, a desk chair missing a wheel, a nightstand leaning against the wall. The air smelled of mildew and old smoke. Then I noticed it, muddy footprints, fresh enough to suggest someone had been here recently. They started at the door, moved across the floor, and then up the wall. My heart skipped a beat as I followed the trail with my flashlight. It went straight toward the ceiling vent, a rusted grate partially hanging from its frame. The footprints ended there. I crouched and examined the vent, shining the light into the dark duct. The space inside was black, narrow, coated in dust and cobwebs, and I could hear the faint sound of the wind moving through it, whistling softly. Then it hit me, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the fog of the room and the static of my thoughts. My name, my own name, spoken softly, almost coaxing, almost mocking. My blood ran cold. I spun in a circle, flashlight beams scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing. No movement, no one hiding, just the quiet hum of my radio static in the corner of the room. I called in my location and situation, requesting backup, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. While I waited, I checked the rest of the room, every corner, the bathroom, under the bed, the closet. The closet door creaked as I pushed it open. Dust fell in clouds, and the smell of rot hit stronger. Nothing. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it could be someone squatting in the vents, or maybe even an animal. I'd seen strange things in abandoned buildings before, but the whisper of my name, nothing I'd ever encountered came close to that. I pulled on my gloves, ran my hands over my flashlight and radio, checking everything twice. The footprints gone. Just gone. No mud on the floor, no marks leading to the vent, nothing. I stepped back, scanning the walls. The dust and decay were untouched except for the light grime from my boots. My heart raced. I considered the possibilities. Someone had been there, someone had left, and somehow they had covered every trace. I walked back down the hall, careful with each step. The fog outside had crept further in, seeping under the broken windows, curling along the baseboards. My flashlight flickered once, and for a moment, I froze, convinced I'd seen movement at the end of the hall, just beyond the light. I approached slowly. A door to another room, room 14, was ajar. I pushed it gently. Empty. No footprints, no movement. The window was shattered, and the night fog pressed in like fingers brushing my face. I could hear my own breathing, and the faint creak of the building settling. Then I heard it again, softer this time, almost swallowed by the building's sighing, my name. I froze completely. I strained to listen, trying to catch any sound besides the static in my radio. Nothing. I moved closer to the office, keeping my flashlight ahead. My mind raced with everything I knew about abandoned places, animals, squatting humans, wind patterns, but nothing fit. Nothing explained the whisper. When backup arrived, 2 units pulling in behind me with lights cutting through the fog, I guided them to room 12. We checked the ceiling vent together, shining our lights into the duct, listening carefully. Nothing. Not a sound, not a mark, nothing. The floor was clean. the muddy footprints vanished completely. I went over every inch of the room with the backup officers, kicking around debris, checking walls, moving furniture, scanning the floor. Absolutely nothing. It was like the footprints had never existed. We expanded our search, checking each room methodically, marking what we had searched. Every room was the same, abandoned and rotting, but no new footprints, no sounds, no disturbances. It was impossible to know if someone had been in the building that night, or if I had imagined the noise and tracks. But I hadn't. I knew the footprints had been there. I knew the whisper had been real. The only evidence left was the smell of damp wood and rot, the faint echo of my flashlight against the walls, and the lingering fog that pressed into every corner of the building. By the time we left, we walked the perimeter together, flashlights cutting through the fog. No tracks in the parking lot, no signs of someone leaving, no tire marks, no footprints in the soft gravel or wet patches near the side doors. The motel looked abandoned in every sense, yet something had been inside. Something that had moved without leaving a trace. I checked my cruiser as I got back in, double-checking my equipment, my radio, everything functional, nothing out of place. My partner looked at me, and we shared a quiet nod. We filed the report, noting the 911 hang-up, the abandoned building, and the strange circumstances, but the truth was, there was no concrete evidence of anything unusual except for what I had seen and heard. Even the dispatcher's recording didn't clarify anything. The 911 call was just static. No voice, no background noise. It was as if someone had picked up the line and let go immediately, leaving only the hum behind. We left the motel behind, fog swallowing the neon sign again, its light flickering weakly before fading. On the drive back, I kept checking the rearview mirror, the road, the fog, convinced that at any moment something would appear, track us, or step out of the mist. Nothing happened, of course, but the unease stayed with me. Weeks later, I drove by the motel during the day, curious, hoping for some explanation. The building looked just like it had that night, abandoned, broken, decaying. I scanned the parking lot and the lawn. No footprints, no fresh marks in the dirt. Just the same silent ruin. I walked inside carefully, taking note of the floor and the rooms, looking for any sign of the tracks. None. It was as if the entire incident had been erased by some force I couldn't see. I can't explain what I experienced that night. The footprints, the whisper, the vanishing traces, they don't fit into any normal explanation, at least not that I've found. But I know what I saw and heard. It was real, and it left a mark on me that night. I still patrol the 101 regularly, drive past that stretch, watch the fog roll in over the abandoned motel. The neon sign still flickers sometimes in my memory, a broken light cutting through the mist, and every time I think about it, I feel the weight of the quiet, the whisper, the vanishing footprints. I never saw anyone, never found a trace, and nothing ever repeated like that night. But I also know that somewhere in that building, or maybe in that fog, there was someone, or something, that wanted to be seen and left without a trace, reminding me that even in the most ordinary places, the unexpected can be terrifyingly real. I had just finished my late shift paperwork when the call came in. A nurse at the local psychiatric ward reported an agitated patient, someone who had been escalating all evening and hadn't calmed down despite the staff's efforts. The hospital was quiet when I arrived, the parking lot nearly empty, the faint hum of fluorescent lights spilling from the front entrance. The cold December wind bit at my face as I walked to the automatic doors, which slid open with that slow, familiar creak. There was no one at the reception desk, just a nurse's jacket draped over a chair and a small desk lamp flickering weakly. The hospital smelled faintly antiseptic, a mix of bleach and old air, the way it always does in wards like this. The nurse who called me met me in the lobby, her eyes tight and tired. She didn't need to explain much. I followed her through the corridors, past locked doors and secured areas, until we reached the psych ward. The hallway was dim, the overhead lights humming low, the floor tiles cold under my boots. It had that same sterile smell, but stronger here, with the faint tang of sweat and disinfectant. The doors leading into the patient rooms were all shut, locked from the inside, with heavy bolts and keypads that glowed faintly in the dim light. I could see the reflection of the fluorescent tubes in the polished metal of the handles, and my own face in the glass panels of some of the doors. As we walked, I noticed a sound that didn't quite belong. It was faint at first, almost like the tapping of fingernails on a hard surface. I froze for a second, listening. The nurse shrugged and told me it was probably just a patient fidgeting, nothing serious. But I could tell it wasn't coming from one of the occupied rooms. The sound was steady, rhythmic, a slow, insistent tap tap tap. It seemed to come from one of the empty rooms at the far end of the hall. The nurse gave me a look that said she didn't want to go in, and she handed me the keys. "Room 14, she said softly, almost like a warning. "No one's in there. The patient was transferred last week." "But that tapping, I don't know." I approached the door slowly, my hand on the cold metal handle. The tapping didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder as I stepped closer, reverberating through the narrow corridor. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the hinges squealing slightly. The room was small, sterile, the kind that seems to strip the air of warmth. The lights overhead were on, but the fluorescent glow made the space feel harsher, colder. Inside, the room was a mess. The bed was unmade, the sheets shredded and twisted into a knot on the floor. Chairs were overturned. The small desk against the wall was scratched and marked. What drew my attention immediately was the walls. Every surface was covered in scribbled notes, written over and over with uneven, jagged handwriting. "They are watching. They are watching. They are watching." The ink was smeared in some places, streaked as if someone had tried to erase it or had been moving frantically. The entire room had an oppressive, chaotic energy, and I could feel it pressing in on me. The tapping was coming from the corner of the room. I approached cautiously, scanning the floor. There was nothing there, just an empty corner, a small pile of debris, and the faint scuff marks in the linoleum as if someone had been pacing back and forth. I crouched down to inspect the floor. The tapping continued, steady, methodical. It seemed impossible. There was nothing to make the sound. No tools, no furniture moving, no vent or pipes that could account for it. I checked the ceiling, the walls, even behind the bed frame. Nothing. I backed out slowly, keeping my eyes on the room, the scribbled warnings filling my vision. "They are watching. They are watching." The words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over. I had worked in mental health calls before. I'd seen patients leave messages, carve words into walls, scribble warnings, but always in the presence of someone or as a record of behavior. This felt off, uncomfortable in a way I couldn't place. I stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind me. The tapping followed me immediately, not in the faint, distant way of sound traveling through walls, but directly, as if it were tracking my steps. Every empty room I passed echoed with that rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It bounced against the linoleum, off the ceiling tiles, down the corridor. The sound was relentless, synchronized with my own movements, growing louder the further I walked. I glanced at the locked doors of the other rooms. The reflection of the fluorescent lights in the glass panels made the hall seem longer than it was, endless almost. The rhythm stayed with me, echoing through each empty space, turning what should have been a normal hallway into something oppressive. I tried to focus on the practical. Maybe there was a maintenance issue, water dripping, a loose vent, but everything seemed in place. Nothing should have been making that sound. I slowed my pace, trying to pinpoint it, but the tapping was everywhere. It wasn't random. It had a pattern, almost like someone was intentionally marking each step I took, matching it. My pulse picked up. The smell of antiseptic was stronger here, harsh in my nostrils, and the faint odor of sweat from previous patients lingered like a warning. I kept moving toward the nurse's station, my boots clicking against the tiles. The tapping didn't stop. It followed me past rooms that were clearly empty, past the locked doors, down the hallway toward the exit. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, trying to ignore it, but the sound seemed to find every corner, every empty space, filling it completely. By the time I reached the main hall, the tapping had become a chorus. It was louder, persistent, and unnervingly precise. I found the nurse waiting near the station, her hands wrapped around a clipboard like it was a shield. I told her the room was empty, that I couldn't find anything, but she just nodded, her eyes wide. She seemed to understand without words. I walked out of the ward, into the slightly warmer air of the hospital corridor. The tapping didn't stop immediately. It lingered, echoing in the back of my mind. Once I got to the front lobby, it faded slightly, but the rhythm was still there, a low, insistent reminder. I reported the situation to dispatch, wrote it all down in my notes, and waited with the nurse until the patient's file could be reviewed. Staff checked the room again, every inch. There was nothing there, no signs of anyone hiding, no equipment, no broken fixtures. Just the shredded sheets, the walls full of writing, and the unrelenting imprint of something that shouldn't have been happening. By the time I left the hospital, the night was calm outside. The snow had started falling lightly, covering the parking lot in a quiet white. My cruiser's heater hummed as I drove, the streets empty, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. The tapping was gone from the hallway, but I couldn't shake it from my mind. Every time I thought about that room, the words scrawled across the walls came back, echoing in my head. They are watching. The next day, I checked back with the ward. The room had been cleaned, the walls repainted. Staff reported nothing unusual overnight. There was no trace of anyone entering or exiting illegally. Whatever had made that sound, whatever had left the room in that state, remained a mystery. I returned to my regular patrols, but every time I passed a quiet hospital, a dark hallway, or an empty room, I felt that same tension creeping up my spine. A reminder of the night the tapping followed me, steady, methodical, in a place where nothing should have been able to move on its own. I never got a definitive answer, but I learned to respect the unknown in a hospital setting, to trust my instincts when something felt off. It wasn't ghosts or stories, just something real, unsettling, and completely human, leaving its mark in ways I couldn't always explain. The night stayed with me, and I still remember the echo of that tapping, clear and precise, in the back of my mind every time I enter an empty ward. I had just finished my late shift paperwork when the call came in. A nurse at the local psychiatric ward reported an agitated patient, someone who had been escalating all evening and hadn't calmed down despite the staff's efforts. The hospital was quiet when I arrived, the parking lot nearly empty, the faint hum of fluorescent lights spilling from the front entrance. The cold December wind bit at my face as I walked to the automatic doors, which slid open with that slow, familiar creak. There was no one at the reception desk, just a nurse's jacket draped over a chair and a small desk lamp flickering weakly. The hospital smelled faintly antiseptic, a mix of bleach and old air, the way it always does in wards like this. The nurse who called me met me in the lobby, her eyes tight and tired. She didn't need to explain much. I followed her through the corridors, past locked doors and secured areas, until we reached the psych ward. The hallway was dim, the overhead lights humming low, the floor tiles cold under my boots. It had that same sterile smell, but stronger here, with the faint tang of sweat and disinfectant. The doors leading into the patient rooms were all shut, locked from the inside, with heavy bolts and keypads that glowed faintly in the dim light. I could see the reflection of the fluorescent tubes in the polished metal of the handles, and my own face in the glass panels of some of the doors. As we walked, I noticed a sound that didn't quite belong. It was faint at first, almost like the tapping of fingernails on a hard surface. I froze for a second, listening. The nurse shrugged and told me it was probably just a patient fidgeting, nothing serious. But I could tell it wasn't coming from one of the occupied rooms. The sound was steady, rhythmic, a slow, insistent tap, tap, tap. It seemed to come from one of the empty rooms at the far end of the hall. The nurse gave me a look that said she didn't want to go in, and she handed me the keys. "Room 14, she said softly, almost like a warning. "No one's in there. The patient was transferred last week." But that tapping, I don't know. I approached the door slowly, my hand on the cold metal handle. The tapping didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder as I stepped closer, reverberating through the narrow corridor. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the hinges squealing slightly. The room was small, sterile, the kind that seems to strip the air of warmth. The lights overhead were on, but the fluorescent glow made the space feel harsher, colder. Inside, the room was a mess. The bed was unmade, the sheets shredded and twisted into a knot on the floor. Chairs were overturned. The small desk against the wall was scratched and marked. What drew my attention immediately was the walls. Every surface was covered in scribbled notes, written over and over with uneven, jagged handwriting. "They are watching. They are watching. They are watching." The ink was smeared in some places, streaked as if someone had tried to erase it or had been moving frantically. The entire room had an oppressive, chaotic energy, and I could feel it pressing in on me. The tapping was coming from the corner of the room. I approached, cautiously, scanning the floor. There was nothing there, just an empty corner, a small pile of debris, and the faint scuff marks in the linoleum, as if someone had been pacing back and forth. I crouched down to inspect the floor. The tapping continued, steady, methodical. It seemed impossible. There was nothing to make the sound. No tools, no furniture moving, no vent or pipes that could account for it. I checked the ceiling, the walls, even behind the bed frame. Nothing. I backed out slowly, keeping my eyes on the room, the scribbled warnings filling my vision. "They are watching. They are watching. The words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over. I had worked in mental health calls before. I'd seen patients leave messages, carve words into walls, scribble warnings, but always in the presence of someone or as a record of behavior. This felt off, uncomfortable in a way I couldn't place. I stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind me. The tapping followed me immediately, not in the faint, distant way of sound traveling through walls, but directly, as if it were tracking my steps. Every empty room I passed echoed with that rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It bounced against the linoleum, off the ceiling tiles, down the corridor. The sound was relentless, synchronized with my own movements, growing louder the further I walked. I glanced at the locked doors of the other rooms. The reflection of the fluorescent lights in the glass panels made the hall seem longer than it was, endless almost. The rhythm stayed with me, echoing through each empty space, turning what should have been a normal hallway into something oppressive. I tried to focus on the practical. Maybe there was a maintenance issue, water dripping, a loose vent, but everything seemed in place. Nothing should have been making that sound. I slowed my pace, trying to pinpoint it, but the tapping was everywhere. It wasn't random. It had a pattern, almost like someone was intentionally marking each step I took, matching it. My pulse picked up. The smell of antiseptic was stronger here, harsh in my nostrils, and the faint odor of sweat from previous patients lingered like a warning. I kept moving toward the nurse's station, my boots clicking against the tiles. The tapping didn't stop. It followed me past rooms that were clearly empty, past the locked doors, down the hallway toward the exit. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, trying to ignore it, but the sound seemed to find every corner, every empty space, filling it completely. By the time I reached the main hall, the tapping had become a chorus. It was louder, persistent, and unnervingly precise. I found the nurse waiting near the station, her hands wrapped around a clipboard like it was a shield. I told her the room was empty, that I couldn't find anything, but she just nodded, her eyes wide. She seemed to understand without words. I walked out of the ward, into the slightly warmer air of the hospital corridor. The tapping didn't stop immediately. It lingered, echoing in the back of my mind. Once I got to the front lobby, it faded slightly, but the rhythm was still there, a low, insistent reminder. I reported the situation to dispatch, wrote it all down in my notes, and waited with the nurse until the patient's file could be reviewed. Staff checked the room again, every inch. There was nothing there, no signs of anyone hiding, no equipment, no broken fixtures. Just the shredded sheets, the walls full of writing, and the unrelenting imprint of something that shouldn't have been happening. By the time I left the hospital, the night was calm outside. The snow had started falling lightly, covering the parking lot in a quiet white. My cruiser's heater hummed as I drove, the streets empty, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. The tapping was gone from the hallway, but I couldn't shake it from my mind. Every time I thought about that room, the words scrawled across the walls came back, echoing in my head. They are watching. The next day, I checked back with the ward. The room had been cleaned, the walls repainted. Staff reported nothing unusual overnight. There was no trace of anyone entering or exiting illegally. Whatever had made that sound, whatever had left the room in that state, remained a mystery. I returned to my regular patrols, but every time I passed a quiet hospital, a dark hallway, or an empty room, I felt that same tension creeping up my spine. A reminder of the night the tapping followed me, steady, methodical, in a place where nothing should have been able to move on its own. I never got a definitive answer, but I learned to respect the unknown in a hospital setting, to trust my instincts when something felt off. It wasn't ghosts or stories, just something real, unsettling, and completely human, leaving its mark in ways I couldn't always explain. The night stayed with me, and I still remember the echo of that tapping, clear and precise, in the back of my mind every time I enter an empty ward. I was working the night shift in downtown Chicago when I got the call. A noise complaint on the 32nd floor of a high-rise apartment building. The dispatcher's voice sounded routine, but there was something faintly urgent in the background. Like the woman who called wasn't just annoyed, she was worried. I remember looking at the time. It was just after midnight, the city quiet except for distant sirens and the occasional hum of traffic below. The building itself was older, one of those concrete towers that had been up since the 70s, with that faint smell of dust and cleaning chemicals in the lobby. The elevators creaked as they moved, the kind of sound that reminded you just how old a building could get. I pressed the button for the 32nd floor, waiting as the elevator climbed. The lights flickered twice on the way up, and I noticed a faint burning smell even before the doors opened. When I stepped out onto the carpeted hallway, it felt colder than the lobby, and I had a small chill run down my spine. The walls were beige, dotted with the occasional framed photograph from tenants, but everything seemed dim and tired. I followed the number the dispatcher had given me, walking slowly, scanning the doors. When I reached the apartment, the door was slightly cracked open. The crack wasn't much, maybe an inch, but it was enough to see inside. At first, I thought someone had just been careless and left it ajar, but the moment I peered inside, my instincts went up. The apartment looked like a storm had ripped through it. Furniture was overturned, couches tipped onto their sides, chairs scattered across the floor, and a coffee table upside down. There was a faint smell of burnt plastic that hit me as soon as I entered. It was subtle but persistent, like someone had tried to burn something in the kitchen or living room, but hadn't fully succeeded. I drew my flashlight and shone it across the room, taking in the chaos. My booted feet crunched against scattered debris, books, a shattered lamp, pieces of what looked like a burned toaster. On the couch sat a phone, positioned upright as if it had been placed there intentionally. The screen flashed "Help me" over and over, the reflection from the screen cutting across the overturned furniture in flickering light. I didn't know if whoever had left it had typed it or if it had been a pre-recorded video, but the words were clear, screaming without a sound. I felt my heart pick up slightly. The smell of burnt plastic got stronger as I moved closer to the kitchen. The light from my flashlight bounced off the walls, showing smears of dark fingerprints climbing the plaster, stretching almost to the ceiling. They were erratic, messy, desperate, like someone had been trying to climb or hold onto something for support. I crouched down to examine them. Some were smeared as if someone had slid across the wall, leaving streaks of dirt and sweat. There were even handprints on the ceiling above the stove, which made me pause. Whoever had been here hadn't just moved. They had panicked, fought, tried to escape or get help. The intensity of it was visible in every smudge and streak. I moved slowly through the apartment, calling out over my radio that I was inside. There was no response, no voice, no movement. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I checked every room, the bedroom, the small bathroom, the tiny hallway leading to a second bedroom. Each was empty. Clothes were thrown across the floor, drawers were pulled open, some even torn from the walls. In the bathroom, the mirror was cracked, a spiderweb of fissures running across it, but no one was hiding there. There was a faint smell of burnt hair that made my stomach churn, but still no one. I circled back to the living room, scanning again. The phone was still on, still flashing the same message. I felt my pulse tighten. I reached down and picked it up carefully, tapping on the screen to see if it would play a video or audio. A recording started, low and muffled. I could hear breathing, rapid and uneven, and at one point a faint thump, like someone had fallen. The audio cut out quickly, then started again, repeating the same short clip over and over. Whoever had been here had been terrified, and the panic was etched into the recording. I called backup again, this time requesting an immediate response, explaining the situation. The open door, the overturned furniture, the smeared walls, the phone recording, everything. While I waited, I started photographing the fingerprints, the overturned furniture, the burnt marks on the plastic, anything that could serve as evidence. I made sure to keep my flashlight sweeping the apartment. The smell of burnt plastic and faint smoke lingered, but there were no active flames, no fire damage beyond scorched furniture and scorched electrical outlets. Minutes passed, each longer than the last. The city below hummed softly, distant car horns, faint sirens, nothing that would give away what had happened up here. I felt a growing unease. Something about the apartment didn't sit right, beyond the obvious signs of panic. The air was thick, and I could hear the creaking of the building settling under its own weight. At one point, I thought I heard the faint scrape of shoes on the floor, a dragging sound from the far bedroom. My head snapped toward it, flashlight swinging, but there was nothing. I crept closer, checking under the beds, inside closets, behind doors. Empty. When backup finally arrived, it was two uniformed officers and a sergeant. They moved in carefully, each carrying flashlights and radios, their expressions tense as they took in the scene. I walked them through what I had seen, pointing out the fingerprints, the overturned furniture, the burnt plastic smell, the phone recording. They started their own sweep, carefully searching the apartment from room to room. After a thorough search, it was confirmed, the apartment was empty. No one had been there since whatever had caused the chaos. No forced entry, no sign of someone leaving violently. Just the aftermath of a struggle, a panic, and that phone recording left behind like a plea in the dark. The fingerprints on the wall were cataloged, photographs taken, but there was no suspect, no victim, and no clear explanation. We eventually called the building management. They confirmed that the tenant lived alone and hadn't been seen for 2 days. Family or friends had reported him missing after they couldn't reach him. There were no notes, no emails, nothing to suggest a reason for the destruction inside the apartment. The phone had been his, but the message had been created on the device in a panicked moment, and then the recording had ended. Whoever had been here, the tenant or someone else, had vanished. We stayed in the apartment for another hour, checking and rechecking. Nothing. Eventually, the sergeant instructed us to leave and wait for the building's security footage, which might shed some light on who had been here and what had happened. Walking back down the hall, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone, but the hallway was empty, silent except for our boots on the carpet and the faint hum of the elevator shafts. Later, reviewing the footage, it showed the tenant coming home late the previous night. He entered the apartment alone, carrying groceries, nothing unusual. A few hours later, the cameras caught movement inside the apartment that suggested a struggle, but the footage was dark and chaotic, with no clear view of who or what was involved. Then, the video cut out, the last frame showing the tenant standing in the kitchen, hands raised slightly, as if trying to grab something invisible. That was the last anyone saw of him. Days later, the building management confirmed that the apartment had been secured, the locks changed, and maintenance had cleaned up the debris. The phone, with the Help ME recording, was left with police evidence. Investigators continued to search for the missing tenant, checking hospitals, shelters, and known associates, but there was no trace. It was as if he had disappeared entirely. The case stayed with me. I couldn't shake the image of that frantic, smudged wall, the phone flashing helplessly on the couch, and the eerie silence that had filled the apartment. Weeks later, a neighbor mentioned seeing the tenant's car still parked outside the building, the same spot it had been in for years. No one had seen him leave. Maintenance workers reported finding small streaks of dirt leading toward the balcony, but the balcony itself was secure, with no way down from the 32nd floor. Eventually, the police filed it as a missing person case, unresolved but fully documented. The apartment remained vacant for months. When the next tenant moved in, they mentioned feeling uneasy, sensing that the place had shadows in the walls, a nervous energy in the air. The building management dismissed it, but I remembered that apartment every time I drove past that tower. The details, the overturned furniture, the burnt plastic smell, the fingerprints stretching up the wall, the flashing phone pleading for help, stayed with me. Realistic, clear, impossible to ignore. No ghosts, no fairy tales, just a missing person, evidence of panic, and a trail that led nowhere. A normal city apartment turned into a scene of terror, and a life that vanished into nothing. I think about it when I'm on patrol at night, and I pass old high-rise buildings. I remember the smell, the walls, the phone. It's a case I'll never forget, not because it was solved, but because it remains entirely real, entirely possible, and completely without explanation. Whoever was in that apartment that night, struggling, fighting, trying to call for help, they are gone. And the evidence of their panic lingers, as if frozen in time, waiting for someone else to notice. Even now, I keep the photographs on my office desk. The fingerprints, the overturned furniture, the phone screen glowing in the dark. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones that could happen anywhere, to anyone, without any supernatural force. Just human panic, human fear, and a life that slips away too fast to save. I was on routine patrol when the call came in. An alarm had been triggered at a shuttered auto parts warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, a section of town that had been mostly abandoned for years. The dispatcher didn't have much more to go on, just the location and the type of alarm, motion sensors inside the building. I'd been on the night shift for nearly 10 years, and I'd learned that a triggered alarm in an empty warehouse usually meant nothing more than a raccoon or some local kids looking for trouble. Still, alarms couldn't be ignored. I parked my cruiser across the street, leaving my headlights on low, so I could see the general outline of the building without giving away my exact location. The warehouse was a massive rectangle of faded metal siding, the paint peeling and rust forming along the edges of the corrugated steel. The sign above the main doors was half torn off, the letters long gone, leaving nothing but rust and shadow. The streets around the warehouse were quiet, the kind of quiet that felt too thick, like it had weight. My boots crunched against the gravel lot as I approached the main entrance. The lock on the front door had been cut years ago, a jagged metal hinge sticking out where the padlock used to be. I swung the door open and stepped inside. My flashlight cut through the darkness, but even its beam couldn't fully reach the far corners of the warehouse. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy, coating every surface. The smell hit me first, stale oil, rust, and something else I couldn't identify. I moved cautiously, my flashlight sweeping over empty shelves, rusted machinery, and stacks of tires. The place was vast, and the high ceiling made my voice echo every time I breathed too loudly. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, but inside, it was almost completely silent. My hand hovered near my holster, though there was no reason to draw it yet. It was just an old warehouse, probably empty except for rodents. I checked the aisles one by one, the sound of my boots clicking against the concrete floor the only noise I made. Then I heard it, faint metal scraping above me. My flashlight wavered as I turned toward the sound, trained on the steel beams supporting the lofts that ran along the back wall. It was high up, the kind of lofts where they stored old inventory that wasn't needed anymore. I took a slow step toward the ladder that led up to one of the lofts, every sense on alert. The scraping stopped for a moment, as if whatever it was had noticed me. The ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed. Dust rained down in a fine cloud, and I coughed to keep it from filling my lungs. When I reached the top, I froze. Hundreds of mannequins were stacked haphazardly, leaning against each other like a grotesque army. Some were missing arms, others had broken legs, one had no head at all. The others looked intact, but their plastic faces stared blankly. One of the mannequins had scratches across its chest, fresh and deep, as though it had been clawed by something sharp. My heart began to race. I forced myself to take slow breaths and moved closer, scanning every detail. The mannequins were oddly positioned, almost as if they were arranged to block certain pathways. I ran a hand over the cold plastic of one's shoulder. It was dusty, but there were no signs of recent movement other than the scratches. The warehouse was still empty, still quiet except for the faint hum of my flashlight's battery and the distant city noises leaking through broken windows. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One by one, the mannequins were turning toward me. Their heads, plastic joints creaking faintly as they shifted, aligned as if they were watching me. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The air seemed thicker, heavier, every breath a little more labored. I swore I could hear a faint scraping again, like metal against concrete, but it wasn't coming from the loft above. It was coming from the walls themselves, from the shadows. I stepped back toward the ladder, shining my flashlight on every angle. The mannequins' heads were all facing me now, their blank eyes staring. I could feel a cold sweat run down my back. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the wind had shifted the bodies. Maybe the vibration from the warehouse settling had caused them to tip slightly. Maybe someone had been hiding here. All the explanations sounded weak, hollow, and useless. I called for backup. The radio crackled to life, my voice tense but steady. I gave the location, described what I'd seen, and asked for additional units to respond immediately. My flashlight bounced across the room as I moved back toward the ladder, every instinct screaming to get out. The mannequins didn't move again, but I could feel them watching as I climbed down. While waiting for backup, I took a cautious look around the main floor. The warehouse was full of debris, old boxes, and broken shelving, but nothing seemed out of place. No footprints, no fresh trash, nothing except the same thick layer of dust that had been everywhere. I walked slowly, the beam of my flashlight sweeping the shadows in every direction. Occasionally, I caught a glint of metal or a reflection off plastic, but every time I focused on it, it was just more debris. Finally, I heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with unease. I knew that the moment the other units arrived, whatever had caused the mannequins to move, or appear to move, would vanish. I heard their boots on the gravel outside, radios chirping, and then the heavy thump of doors opening. I directed the first unit to the front entrance, explaining quickly what I had seen. They moved in cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness. I followed behind, my own light sweeping the aisles, scanning every corner. The mannequins were frozen again, exactly as they had been when I first climbed down. Not a head had turned, not an arm had shifted. We combed the warehouse from end to end. Every loft, every shelf, Every stack of boxes was inspected thoroughly. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and no one was found. There were no signs of forced entry except the long broken padlock, no fingerprints other than my own, no discarded items, no hidden compartments. Even the scratches on the mannequin's chest were still there, but they showed no sign of being caused by a person who had been present recently. It made no sense. The officers exchanged confused glances. One of them muttered something about the warehouse settling or a prank, but I shook my head. The scratches didn't appear naturally, and the mannequins' heads had clearly shifted while I was up there. Nobody else had been inside. No drafts, no wind, nothing that could have made them move that way. I knew what I saw, even if no one else could explain it. We stayed until the building was secured and the alarm system was temporarily disabled. I filed the report in painstaking detail, noting the mannequins, the scratches, the movement, and the lack of any evidence to explain it. When I left, the warehouse loomed behind me, silent and still. The mannequins stared down from the loft, plastic faces blank, but I could feel the memory of their sudden, synchronized movement clinging to me. That night, back at the precinct, I couldn't shake it. The warehouse haunted my thoughts, the sound of the metal scraping, the countless blank faces turned toward me, the feeling of being watched in complete emptiness. I went over every possible explanation, each one falling apart under scrutiny. By morning, I had convinced myself that maybe it was exhaustion or stress, the result of long hours on patrol and too much caffeine. But even then, a cold knot of unease lingered in my stomach. Weeks later, I returned to the warehouse during the day with another officer. The sun cut through the dusty windows, illuminating everything. The mannequins were still in the same loft, stacked haphazardly but unmoving, just plastic forms with empty eyes. I ran my hand over the scratches. They were faded now, but I could still see faint red marks in the grooves. We scoured the building again, found nothing unusual, nothing alive, nothing that could explain it. I closed the warehouse door behind me, locking it as best as I could, and walked back to my car. Even in the bright daylight, I felt a weight on my shoulders, a strange, silent presence that seemed to cling to the building itself. Over time, I got used to thinking about it less, focusing on patrols and paperwork, but I never stopped noticing when mannequins or figures appeared in unusual positions anywhere I went. My training, my experience, told me it was impossible, yet I knew exactly what I had seen. Hundreds of lifeless figures, all turning at once, as if to acknowledge me, and then frozen again when others arrived. To this day, I can't explain it. I know there was no person hiding, no mechanism, no prank. All I know is that warehouse, the loft full of mannequins, and the moment they all turned toward me. And while I haven't returned inside after that day, I still drive past the old industrial district and catch glimpses of that warehouse through the overgrown weeds and broken windows. It sits there, silent and empty, but I feel like it's waiting, and I know, without a doubt, that if I stepped inside again, those mannequins would turn toward me once more. The memory of it is burned into my mind, clear, real, and inescapable.